beyond. So thank you. Couldn't have done it without you both. I'm incredibly grateful. Okay, so now let's move into today's sermon. So today, I'm excited to kick off a new sermon series called Practicing Agape. We talk a lot about agape here at the River. It's one of our foundational concepts. So let me start with just a quick review of why that is, and then we'll dive into the new material for this series, which is perspectives around actually practicing agape. So in Greek, the language that the New Testament was written in, there are multiple words for the English word love. Can we get that slide up there? Oh yeah, okay. So these various words correspond to different types of love. For example, there's a Greek word for erotic love, a different word for love between friends, another for love between family members, and so on. The word for love that we see in the New Testament is agape. And agape refers to a specific kind of love. The unconditional love that God has for us and that we are called to show to ourselves and to one another. Unlike other forms of love, agape is not restricted to certain kinds of people or relationships. Instead, it is for everyone. Agape is not a kind of love that is contingent upon specific identities, upon familiarity, or upon desirable qualities or behaviors. Instead, it is given freely. Agape recognizes that every person has inherent dignity and worth, that every person deserves to have their belovedness celebrated, that we are all connected to each other and to creation, and that our flourishing is bound up together. The New Testament makes a big deal out of agape, arguing that it is central to following the way of Jesus. So let's take a look at a few passages where it comes up. In the Gospel of Matthew, we see this: "You shall agape the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall agape your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So here we have the greatest commandment: unconditionally love God and unconditionally love your neighbor as you unconditionally love yourself. All three directions: God, self, other, they all matter equally. And according to Jesus, this is what faith is all about. Everything rests on unconditional love. Anything else is secondary. In the Gospel of John, we see this: "I give you a new commandment, that you agape one another, just as I have agape you. You also should agape one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have agape for one another." In this passage, Jesus said that those who seek to follow him will be known by their unconditional love. The only way to follow Jesus is to embrace unconditional love. Otherwise, according to Jesus' own words, we are following something else. It is not our Bible knowledge, our prayer practices, or our church attendance that mark us as followers of Jesus. These are all good things, and we really do want you to come to church. But what's actually most important to our faith is the presence of agape in our lives. The emphasis on agape continues into the epistles, letters written by leaders to early Christian churches. The letters to the Romans says this: "The commandments are summed up in this word: you shall agape your neighbor as yourself." Agape does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, agape is the fulfilling of the law. Here we see the greatest commandment pop up again, and we see this idea that agape does no wrong. Another way of putting that is agape does no harm. This is one helpful way of evaluating whether or not something is in line with agape or not. Does it cause harm? If it does, then it is definitely not agape. Agape will go further than this, of course. It will bring some positive good, but at the very least, it should not lead to harm for ourselves, others, or the world around us. In the letter to the Galatians, we see this. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through agape. That's a pretty bold statement. The only thing that matters in our faith is how it is expressed through unconditional love. And finally, in the first epistle of John, we see this. Beloved, let us agape one another because agape is from God. Everyone who agapes is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not agape does not know God, for God is agape. Two bold statements here. If we don't know unconditional love, then we don't know God. And God is unconditional love. To say that God is something is a big deal. Agape is central to following the way of Jesus. Many of us are already on board with this idea, but some of the feedback I've heard from members of our community over the past year is that understanding the importance of agape doesn't necessarily make it clear what to do next. How do we actually go about unconditionally loving ourselves, others, God, and the world? What does unconditional love look like? How do we put agape into practice? So these are great questions, and they're the ones that are going to guide our conversations over the next month. Now, I'm not going to make any promises that you will come out of this sermon series with a clear 10-step agape action plan. But my hope is that you will walk away from the series with some helpful perspectives, maybe feeling a little bit more inspired, and perhaps feeling a deeper sense that we're all in this together. So as I prepared for this sermon, it occurred to me that there are a variety of ways that we talk about love. Some of these include love as a feeling, love as a characteristic, and love as a belief. None of these frameworks is wrong. Actually, each one is helpful in some ways and limiting in others, which is why having a number of frameworks is helpful. And to the list, I'd like to add love as a practice. So let's take a look at each one. Love as a feeling. The feeling of love can be warm and positive. It can be steady, or it can be euphoric. Depending on the circumstances, it can include attraction, desire, devotion, loyalty, closeness, commitment, and trust. It can be an incredibly powerful force, but it's also one that can ebb and flow. The feeling of love may come and it may go. And in this way, it differs from the constancy of unconditional love. Unconditional love often includes feeling, but it is not wholly contingent upon it. That would make it conditional. Now, don't get me wrong, feelings are incredibly important. As both a pastor and a trained therapist, I encourage all of us to spend more time identifying and sitting with our feelings. But feelings should inform our actions, not dictate them. Another way that we talk about love is love as a characteristic. This can be incredibly helpful when we're evaluating and describing actions or beliefs. But it's less so when we apply this word to people by saying that they do or do not have loving personalities. In our culture, when we say that certain people are loving, we often really mean that they are warm and affectionate. And these can absolutely be aspects of unconditional love, but they're not the only ways that love manifests. Another limitation of describing some people as loving is that it seems to imply that you are either loving or you are not. It frames love as something solely innate, rather than something that you can learn or choose or practice or work at. Conceiving of love in this way places immense pressure on those who are labeled loving to always behave in specific loving ways, and at the same time, it lets others off the hook entirely. All of us are called to unconditional love. All of us have the freedom to express that love in ways that are unique to us. And all of us have permission to learn and grow, to mess up and try again, and to embrace all the complexities and paradoxes that make up who we are. A third way that we talk about love is love as a belief. This is a really important one. How we understand love, what we think it looks like, who we believe is deserving of it, all shape our understanding of the world and how it should be. Our beliefs about love influence what we think relationships should look like, how we believe we should treat ourselves, others, and creation, the kinds of policies and systems that we believe will contribute to a more just world. What we believe about love matters a lot, which is one of the reasons why we talk about agape love here at the river so much. But beliefs only go so far. Sometimes we believe things intellectually, but have not fully integrated those beliefs into our emotions, into our bodies, or into our behaviors. Sometimes we believe something and then act in ways that are contrary to that belief. This is all very human, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. And this is the reason why I think that it can be helpful for us to add practice to our list of love frameworks. Love as a practice. What if, in addition to conceiving of love as a feeling, a characteristic, and a belief, we also approached it as a practice? The word practice involves action. It moves beyond theory into something tangible. Practice also often involves repetition. It's not something we do once, but something we return to again and again. Practice implies room for learning and for growth. Even for the expert, there is space for experimentation, innovation, and new applications. Conceiving of love as a practice reminds us that agape love needs to be tangibly expressed, not just felt or passively believed in. It encourages us to reflect on ways that we can actively choose into love for ourselves and for others. And it invites us to lean into curiosity around how to love well, to develop new skills, and to learn from our mistakes. Love as a practice is informed by, but not wholly dependent upon, our feelings. We can choose to love even when we don't have warm feelings, whether that be for ourselves, for God, or for others. Choosing love during such times does not mean becoming a doormat. It does not mean ignoring the messages of our feelings, our bodies, or our desires. But it does mean that our intention to pursue unconditional love is considered alongside the many other inputs that influence our decision-making. Many years ago, during the season of Lent, instead of giving something up, I made a commitment to say something nice to myself every single day. During that time, I was really struggling with self-criticism. And so on the way home from work, I would think of something nice to say to myself, no matter how hard it felt. And I don't mean saying something like fake nice to myself, like we can do with people sometimes. I really challenged myself to come up with something I genuinely believed, no matter how small it was. And what's amazing is that usually after I finally landed on that first small thing, I experienced a softening and suddenly found myself able to say many nice things to myself. During that season, this was how I chose to practice unconditionally loving myself. And in each season of life, the specifics have changed, but I have found it helpful time and again to be thoughtful and intentional about how I seek to practice agape toward God, myself, others, and the world. In some contexts, we practice in order to achieve mastery. But I'm not sure that such a thing is possible or even necessarily the goal when it comes to faith. And so perhaps spiritual practice serves another purpose. Spiritual director Lacey Clark Ellman puts it this way: the spiritual journey is a never-ending pilgrimage, a continuous cycle of departure, arrival, and return. It isn't something to be mastered, rather it is something to be lived. If the spiritual journey is something to be lived, then spiritual practices help bring us back to our intention. Conceiving of love as a practice can help bring us back to our intention to unconditionally love God, unconditionally love ourselves, and to unconditionally love others. As we saw in the passages I shared earlier, practicing agape is the way that we know God and how we know that we are following Jesus. So as I thought about how to help us grow in practicing agape, I came across this quote from writer and cultural anthropologist Mary Catherine Bateson. The human species thinks in metaphors and learns through stories. And so I thought that we could tap into metaphors and into stories to help us today. Jesus shared a few helpful metaphors in the Gospel of Matthew. One day when Jesus was surrounded by crowds, he went up on a mountainside to teach the people. This is often referred to as Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Jesus opened with the Beatitudes, saying surprising and challenging things like, "Blessed are the poor, the mourners, the meek, the hungry, the persecuted, and the peacemakers." And immediately following that, Jesus said this: "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot." So if you do a Google search, you'll see that the term salt of the earth has come to describe people who are good, honest, reasonable, friendly, humble, straightforward, and not pretentious. But I'm not sure that that was what Jesus had in mind when he said this. In fact, this whole metaphor seems quite ambiguous to me. In this cultural context and throughout the Hebrew Bible, salt was used in many different ways. It was used as a valuable form of currency, as a devotional sacrifice, as a sign of a covenantal agreement, as a way to spiritually purify, as a weapon to destroy the land of enemies, and as a means to preserve and season food. That's a lot of different uses for salt. And it's hard to know which of these Jesus may have been referring to. But what is clear is that Jesus was concerned about the people losing sight of their purpose, what they were created for, of the salt losing its saltiness. And what were they and we created for? Well, if we look at Jesus' teachings holistically, we will see that we were created to love and be loved, to experience abundant life and to help others do the same, to help usher in the life-giving, upside-down kingdom of God on earth today. This is what agape love is all about. And if we lose sight of this as the purpose of our lives, then we too will have lost our saltiness. So after talking about salt, Jesus shared a second metaphor. He said, "You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. People do not light a lamp and put it under the bushel basket. Rather, they put it on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." Now, before I say anything else about this passage, I want to acknowledge the ways that language in the Bible and elsewhere around darkness and light has been used in incredibly harmful ways. The idea that white and light are exclusively good and pure, and that black and darkness are exclusively evil and sinful, has been used to perpetuate anti-black racism. That is reason enough to be careful with such language. But it's also important to note that this false binary doesn't reflect the complexity of our world or of light and darkness. I'm sure we can all come up with examples where light has been harmful and darkness has been a blessing. A children's book called God's Holy Darkness does a wonderful job of deconstructing anti-blackness in Christian theology by celebrating ways that darkness, blackness, and night are beautiful, good, and holy. If you want to take a look, we have a copy of this book out in the lounge area. You can check it out after the service. So light and darkness both serve important purposes. Among other things, my husband will tell you that for me, darkness is absolutely essential to getting good sleep. I get very mad at him if he turns the light on while I'm trying to sleep. And as we were reminded during the blackout at the summer retreat, light is very important when you want to read and write. You know, the same thing is true when it comes to spices. They each serve different important purposes. And thank goodness salt is not the only one available to us. I really think that life would be far less delicious. So with that being said, let's return to the light metaphor. Once again, Jesus exhorted the people to live into the purpose they were created for. When we need light, we don't turn on a lamp and then immediately cover it up. That would make little sense. Instead, we let it shine. In the same way, there are times when it makes sense to share our good works, when letting them shine can be helpful to ourselves and to others. In such cases, we shouldn't be secretive or falsely modest. Wisdom is determining when this is appropriate. This can be challenging, but I am here to tell you that right now is one of those times. In this moment, it would be helpful for you to share the ways that you have been pursuing agape and the ways that you've seen others doing so. And to do that, we're going to end today's sermon with a writing exercise. So unlike the reflection exercises from our last sermon series, this time we're going to collect your papers from you. So that means that please try to write neatly so others can read your handwriting. Throughout the rest of the sermon series, we're going to find ways to incorporate what you share, either by hanging sheets in the space in places where you can read them, or perhaps by selecting some to read out loud during the service. It's completely up to you whether or not you want to put your name on the sheet. You're welcome to remain anonymous if you want to. And for those tuning in on YouTube, there will be a way for you to participate via email. So why are we doing this? Earlier, I shared the quote from Mary Catherine Bateson about how we learn through metaphors and stories. I shared some metaphors from Jesus, and now I'd like for us to share our stories with one another. Stories are powerful. They can resonate and inspire in ways that other forms of communication cannot. I'm happy to stand up here and share more stories from my life about practicing agape, but I'm just one person. And agape can be expressed in so many different ways. So it will be helpful for us to hear from diverse voices from all of you. And also, I know that so many of you are up to amazing things. I'd love for our whole community to benefit from the ways that you're growing in and practicing agape. So before we hand out the papers, let me walk you through the prompts and give some examples. The first prompt says, what are some of the ways that agape love expresses itself? Finish this sentence. Agape love blank. For this one, if I was filling this out, I might write something like, agape love enthusiastically makes room at the table. Agape love looks like lunch with a friend during a major loss. Agape love can feel really challenging for me to navigate when the needs of self and other are in conflict. There's no right or wrong way to finish this sentence. Just try to write from the heart. The second prompt says this. Share a story about a recent experience of agape, unconditional love towards self, others, God, or the world. Perhaps it was a way that you sought to practice agape, or maybe it was something you witnessed or heard about. No moment is too small. Every story matters and has the potential to inspire. So here you can write a story about practicing agape. It could be something that you did recently or are trying to do. It doesn't have to be something new. It could be something that you've been doing for a long time, but it should be something that's still recent and relevant to you. Maybe you want to share about a way that you're practicing agape at work, or in your relationships, or in your personal life, or in the community. Or it could be a story about someone else, something you witnessed or heard about recently. For example, I was very inspired by this woman who I will call the upstander at Walgreens the other day. So there was a 91-year-old woman there who was trying to get a vaccine. And she was very, very angry because something had gone wrong in the system and her appointment had not been scheduled correctly. And due to the inability to override the system, like it's built so no one can override it, there was no way for them to possibly take her that morning. The elderly woman became very angry and began yelling and making a big scene and repeatedly calling the pharmacist names. And at this point, this is when the upstander stepped in. She validated the elderly woman's feelings in a way that was meaningful to her. And she also gently pointed out that the names weren't warranted, as it was the system, not the individual pharmacist who was at fault. Then she offered to give up her own appointment and come back later to make room for the elderly woman to be seen. Unfortunately, the system did not allow for that. And then after that, the upstander went on to advocate for the woman. She talked to the store manager about how the situation had not been handled with much empathy for the woman, and how the system's rigidness did a disservice both to the elderly woman and to the pharmacist who was getting yelled at. I was just really impressed with how the upstander advocated for both of the people involved in this situation, as well as how she empathized, remained calm, and tried to make a small sacrifice to ease the burden on the elderly woman. For me, this was an example of agape love in practice. And I remember even as it was happening, I turned to my husband and was like, I have to share about this in my sermon. It was just an amazing moment. So whatever story you share does not have to end with a positive outcome. Not all of our practices do. And maybe it's something where the outcome is still unknown. But it's important to remember that all we're asked to do is try. So now we're going to start the exercise. We're going to start passing out the materials. So you should end up with a pen, a little piece of cardboard, and also a colorful sheet to write on. If after we make it through the sections you're missing anything, just raise your hand and we'll come help you find what you need. We'll give you about 7 minutes to work on it. For some of you, that will be enough time. For others of you, if you are still thinking about it, you can send a longer response later via email. Just send it to mail@rivernyc.org. And that's also what those of you tuning in via YouTube can do. Please send an email if you'd like to participate. And be sure to specify if you'd like your name to be included or not. Either way is completely fine with us. Okay, so we'll put on some reflective music now, and then in about 7 minutes, Mike will come back up here with instructions on how to collect the sheets.